He was still in the darkness of the womb when the struggle began. 2 lives, 1 heartbeat. Inside their mother, the battle for a future was already unfolding, unseen, unheard, but fierce. Before either drew breath, destiny had already whispered its decree. 2 nations, 2 brothers, 1 covenant. In that secret war of the womb, Jacob's hand reached forward, closing around his brother's heel, as if refusing to let go of the promise yet unborn. From the first touch, he was the man who would not release what heaven had spoken. Rebekah felt the turmoil inside her body and cried out to God, "Why is this happening to me?" The Lord answered, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples will be separated from within you. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. It was a prophecy that overturned human order. What should have belonged to the firstborn would fall upon the second, the weaker one, the quiet one. And with that single divine word, history tilted on its axis. From then on, Jacob's life would carry the mark of a promise too heavy for him to hold, and yet too sacred to release. When the day of birth came, the first to emerge was red, covered with hair like a rough garment. They named him Esau, but then came his brother, smaller, smoother, grasping his brother's heel as if demanding entry into the world. They named him Jacob, the one who grasps, the supplanter. It was more than a name. It was a mirror of his nature. Even as a child, Jacob seemed to move with a quiet intensity, a man of the tense, reflective and calculating, while Esau roamed the open fields, wild and free. Isaac loved Esau for his hunts and his game, but Rebekah's heart leaned toward Jacob, drawn by a love she herself couldn't explain, perhaps stirred by the echo of that prophecy still ringing in her soul. Between the 2 brothers, the unseen tension grew like a shadow, stretching across the years. Jacob, quiet but ambitious, watched as Esau lived by appetite, strong, impulsive, untamed. It was only a matter of time before desire and destiny would collide. But destiny does not rush. It waits, weaving its threads in silence. And the day would soon come when one brother's hunger and the other's cunning would open a door that could never again be closed. 2 sons, 1 promise. A heel still caught in its grip, and somewhere between prophecy and pride, a single choice begins to shape the fate of a nation. The sun was falling heavy on the hills of Canaan, turning the air thick and dry. Dust clung to the skin like a second layer of life, and from the horizon came Esau, breathless, sweat-soaked, his bow dangling at his side. The hunt had yielded nothing. The ground gave him no prey that day, only exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at his strength like fire-consuming straw. And as he stumbled into the camp, the scent of lentils filled the air, a simple meal, yet one that would change everything. Jacob sat by the pot, stirring the stew with quiet precision. He was not a hunter of beasts, but of moments, patient, deliberate, waiting for the right time to strike. As Esau approached, the color of the stew, rich and red, caught the hunter's weary eyes. "Quick," he said, "let me have some of that red stew, for I am famished." Jacob looked up slowly. His words came not from cruelty, but calculation. "First," he said, "sell me your birthright." Esau laughed, half in disbelief, half in hunger. "Look, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me?" But Jacob didn't move. "Swear to me first." And Esau swore. The oath passed between them like a shadow across the sun. The bowl was given. Bread, too. The hunter ate, and the man of the tents watched. It was quiet except for the crackle of fire and the sound of Esau's hunger being satisfied. When the bowl was empty, he stood, wiped his mouth and walked away, lighter of appetite but emptied of something far greater. Scripture says, "Thus Esau despised his birthright. In one thoughtless trade, a lineage shifted. The covenant that once flowed from Abraham to Isaac now coursed through Jacob, the man who knew how to wait. Yet the cost of taking what was promised before its time would soon weigh upon his soul. What is hunger, if not the cry of the body for what the spirit refuses to wait for? Esau's appetite was for the now, Jacob's for the eternal, but both would pay a price. Esau would lose his inheritance by impulse. Jacob would gain it through deception. Both would learn that the blessings of God cannot be consumed. They must be carried. The red stew cooled beside the fire, a silent witness to the moment when flesh triumphed over faith. And the smell that once promised comfort would forever remind Jacob of the day he became heir through another man's hunger. Years later, the stories told around the fire would recall that trade, how the firstborn gave away his privilege for a meal, and how the younger brother learned that what begins in cunning rarely ends in peace. For in the quiet victory of Jacob's bargain, another struggle was already awakening, one not with his brother's hunger, but with his brother's heart. One bowl of red, one careless word, and beneath the ashes of an empty fire, jealousy begins to burn. The years passed, and Isaac's sight grew dim. The once strong patriarch, who had walked in his father Abraham's shadow, now trembled in the fading light of age. His voice softened, his eyes clouded, but his desire remained, to pass on the blessing before death's whisper reached his tent. He called for Esau, the firstborn, the hunter of the open country. "My son," he said, "prepare for me the game I love, that I may bless you before I die." The old man's words carried the weight of generations, and Esau, eager and unaware, set out into the wilderness to please his father one last time. But Rebekah heard, and with that overheard command, the echo of God's prophecy awakened inside her, the promise that the older would serve the younger. Was she acting in faith or in fear that God might forget? We may never know. Yet what she planned that day would carve pain into every heart it touched. "Go," she whispered to Jacob, "bring me 2 young goats. I will prepare them as your father loves, and you shall take his blessing instead of your brother." Jacob hesitated. "But my brother is a hairy man, and my skin is smooth. If father touches me, I will bring a curse, not a blessing." Rebekah's answer was quick, trembling, determined. "Let the curse fall on me, my son. Only obey." The plan moved like shadow through the tent. The goats were cooked, Esau's clothes draped over Jacob's shoulders, goatskins wrapped around his arms and neck. The aroma of spiced meat filled the air. Then with cautious steps, Jacob entered his father's presence. "My father," he said. "Who is it, my son?" Isaac's voice wavered. "It is I, Esau, your firstborn." Silence. The sound of a heart testing a lie. "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" Jacob's answer came sharp and reckless. "The Lord your God gave me success." The words hung heavy in the air, God's name invoked to seal deceit. Isaac's hands reached out, trembling. "Come near, that I may touch you." The old fingers brushed the goatskins. "The voice is the voice of Jacob," he murmured, "but the hands are the hands of Esau." And so he blessed him. Oil and words poured over a false identity. "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness. May nations serve you and peoples bow before you." The blessing fell, and with it the weight of heaven's promise, now bound to a lie. Jacob left the tent in silence, the stolen words echoing like thunder in his chest. Moments later, Esau returned with the meal his father had asked for. The truth came like a blade. The old man trembled violently. Esau cried out with a great and bitter cry, "Bless me, me too, my father." But it was too late. The blessing could not be undone. Hatred replaced hunger. And from that day, Esau swore in his heart to kill his brother. When Rebekah heard of it, she urged Jacob to flee. The one who had grasped the heel now had to grasp the road, to run from the ruin his own hands had built. In a tent thick with deceit, a father's touch confused the truth. And outside, somewhere in the distance, footsteps of vengeance began to rise. Night found him with nothing but distance behind and uncertainty ahead. The road stretched toward the north, and fear kept pace with every step. He had left his mother's tent, his father's blessing, his brother's rage. Now there was only open sky and the kind of silence that makes a man hear himself too clearly. When the sun fell and the air turned sharp, Jacob stopped at a lonely place. No walls, no lamp, no voice to answer his name. He chose a stone, set it beneath his head, and lay down on the ground that had once been promised to him. It is one thing to hold a blessing in your hands, It is another to sleep on a promise when your own conscience keeps watch. He closed his eyes, not in peace, but in surrender, the way the weary surrender because there is nothing else to do. And in that sleep, heaven opened. He saw a stairway set upon the earth, its top reaching to the very heights. The messengers of God were ascending and descending upon it, not as tourists of wonder, but as servants on holy errands. Above the stairway the Lord stood and spoke into Jacob's unguarded heart. I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. In you and in your seed all families of the earth will be blessed. I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. The words did not erase the past, but they did reorder the future. Grace did not wait for Jacob to become a better man. Grace found him on the road, a fugitive with a borrowed blessing and a fractured home. He woke with a start, heart beating against the ground. The night air felt electric, as if it still carried the weight of the voice he had heard. Surely the Lord is in this place, he whispered, and I did not know it. Awe cut through him, sharp as the fear that had driven him there, but clean, not cruel. Jacob set the stone upright, poured oil upon it, and marked the ground with a name, Bethel, house of God. A place that had been ordinary became an altar. A wanderer became a worshipper. Then he made a vow, not to purchase God's favor, but to anchor his restless heart to the faithfulness that had just pursued him. If God will be with me and watch over me on this journey, if he will give me bread to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and of all you give me, I will surely give a tenth back. It was a simple promise spoken by a complicated man. But the truest vows are often the ones born in dust and dawn. Morning laid a gold edge on the stones. Jacob lifted the staff, lighter than he had set it down. He had not earned the dream, but the dream had marked him. Heaven had not been far, only hidden. Mercy had not been absent, only silent until the appointed hour. He walked away from Bethel with the memory of a voice and the scent of oil still on his hands. The blessing he carried was no longer only the blessing he had taken. It was now also the blessing he had received, undeserved, unforced, undeniable. Yet promises, even when sure, must pass through the narrow places of life. Paths of covenant often lead through deserts of character. And somewhere beyond the horizon, past the wells and the greetings and the warm welcome of kin, waited a man whose smile was quick and whose bargains were long. The stone stands, the vow stands, the road waits. And ahead, at a distant well, another pair of hands is already arranging the terms. The road from Bethel carried Jacob east, away from the land of promise and toward the country of his mother's kin. Dust clung to his sandals, and memories clung to his heart. His brother's cry, his father's trembling, his mother's hurried blessing. Days turned into weeks before he saw the hills of Haran rise against the horizon. As he approached a well in the field, the same kind of well where his mother's story had begun, shepherds were waiting with their flocks. Jacob asked about Laban, his mother's brother, and while they answered, another figure appeared. A young woman leading sheep through the sunlight. Her name was Rachel, and the moment he saw her, the years of running seemed to pause. The hand that once grasped a heel now reached to roll away a stone, offering water to her flock as tears of joy filled his eyes. The fugitive had found family and something far deeper. When Jacob entered Laban's house, the welcome was warm, almost too warm. Laban embraced him as kin, but behind that embrace was the glint of calculation, the same cunning that mirrored Jacob's own. For a month Jacob worked freely, proving himself diligent and strong. Then Laban spoke, "Because you are my relative, should you work for nothing? Tell me your wages." The answer came without hesitation. "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." Laban agreed easily, and so began the first of Jacob's long labors. 7 years of sweat and waiting. 7 years of watching Rachel from afar as the seasons turned and the flocks grew. Scripture says those years seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Love can make time gentle, but not always safe. At last the day came. The feast was prepared, wine poured, torches lit. Laughter filled the camp, and beneath the noise, deception stirred. When night fell and shadows swallowed the faces, Laban brought not Rachel but Leah, her older sister, into Jacob's tent. Veiled and silent, she entered the darkness where truth could not be seen. Morning revealed what night had concealed. Jacob woke and saw Leah beside him, and his cry was half grief, half rage. "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why have you deceived me?" Laban's answer was smooth as oil. "It is not our custom to give the younger before the older. Complete this week, and then you may have Rachel also, for another 7 years of work." The deceiver had been deceived, the trickster outplayed at his own game. Jacob stayed. He finished the week of celebration for Leah, and then received Rachel as wife, binding himself to 14 years of service and a lifetime of divided love. The tents of Haran became a theater of rivalry and yearning. Leah longed to be loved. Rachel longed to bear children. Between them, the house grew full of sons and sorrow. Yet through all the toil and tension, God's quiet hand remained. Every bleating sheep, every newborn cry, every dawn that rose over Laban's pastures whispered that the promise spoken in Bethel was still alive. Jacob had not lost God's favor, only his sense of control. Sometimes the path of blessing leads through the fields of disappointment. He would stay many more years, his flocks multiplying under God's care, while Laban's envy grew in secret. Love had brought him to this land. Deception would drive him from it. But before he could leave, before he could return to face the brother he had wronged, Jacob would have to learn that the God who gives dreams also tests the heart that receives them. And in Haran, under the heat of labor and the ache of waiting, that lesson had only begun. The tents of love and labor stand quiet in the dawn. But beyond the horizon, the wind carries a new command, one that will send Jacob home. Years passed under the wide sky of Haran. Jacob's hands hardened from labor, his back bent beneath the weight of Laban's endless demands. What had begun as 7 years for love became 20 years of toil and trickery. Yet even as the wages changed and the rules shifted, the Lord's favor rested upon him. Every time Laban sought to cheat him, the flocks multiplied in Jacob's care. The speckled, the spotted, the weak, all flourished under a blessing no deceit could cancel. What Laban thought he owned began to drift quietly toward Jacob, one lamb at a time. Prosperity came not from schemes, but from the unseen hand that had met Jacob at Bethel. And still, the heart that once wrestled for advantage now learned to wait under God's timing. But the tents of success can hide storms beneath their shade. Laban's sons began to whisper, watching Jacob's herds spread like rivers across the fields. Envy took root and suspicion followed. One morning, as Jacob walked among the grazing flocks, he felt the distance between himself and Laban, widening like a crack in the earth. The man who once called him nephew now looked upon him with guarded eyes. And in that uneasy silence, God spoke again. The same voice that had promised a ladder to heaven now called him home. "Return to the land of your fathers, and I will be with you." The words pierced through comfort and fear alike. Home was a memory filled with danger, Esau's wrath, the ghost of deceit, a brother's vow for revenge. Yet obedience leaves no room for delay. Jacob gathered Rachel and Leah to the edge of the field, away from Laban's hearing. The wind whispered through the grass as he spoke of dreams and promises, of how God had seen his affliction and judged between him and their father. Rachel's eyes, bright with loyalty, met Leah's gaze. Two sisters once divided, now united by one truth. They could not remain where deceit ruled. "Do whatever God has told you," they said. That night, as the camp slept, Jacob loaded the camels, gathered the children, the servants, the flocks, everything he had, and turned his face toward Canaan. The torches were dimmed. The sound of hooves and muffled footsteps broke the silence of Haran's valley. It was not rebellion, it was release. Days later, the alarm rose behind them. Laban had discovered their absence and pursued them across the desert. The chase stretched 7 days until he caught them near the hills of Gilead. But before anger could strike, God came to Laban in a dream. Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And so, instead of blood, there were words. They argued, accused, remembered, and finally built a heap of stones as witness between them, a silent treaty between deceit and deliverance. Laban kissed his daughters goodbye and returned to his own place. Jacob watched him disappear into the horizon, a chapter closing without applause. Only the sigh of relief that comes when the past releases its grip. As the camp settled, Jacob lifted his eyes toward the wilderness. The road ahead was not empty. It was guarded. Scripture says the angels of God met him on the way. When he saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." And he named that place Mahanaim, 2 camps. Heaven had joined his journey. The fugitive, who once slept on a stone, now marched beneath an unseen army. Yet the promise of God often walks beside the peril of man. For even as divine messengers surrounded him, another messenger was already on the road, carrying news that would strike fear into Jacob's heart. The herds move south. The dust rises and peace hangs by a thread. For beyond the hills, Esau is coming with 400 men. The desert night pressed close as Jacob pitched his camp near the Jabbok River. Word had come. Esau was on his way with 400 men. The message hit like thunder rolling through dry ground. 20 years had passed since the stolen blessing, but memory does not age. What Jacob had buried in distance was now rising in dust before him. Fear found him easily. Guilt never loses the scent of its host. Yet beneath the fear was a stirring faith, the kind that knows running is no longer an option. Jacob had deceived a father and fled a brother. Now he would have to face both shadows, trusting that God, who had been faithful in Bethel and Haran, would not abandon him at the edge of this river. He divided his people into 2 camps, sending them ahead with flocks and herds arranged like offerings of peace. Each group carried a message for Esau. "Your servant Jacob is coming behind us." It was not flattery, it was surrender. The trickster who once demanded blessings now sought mercy. When the last caravan disappeared into the dusk, Jacob knelt and prayed. His words were not polished, not rehearsed. They were raw and trembling, scraped from a heart that finally understood its need. "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your family, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, for I fear him." The prayer was simple, but in it Jacob laid down every weapon he had ever trusted, his wit, his plans, his pride. Only faith remained. The night deepened. The sound of livestock faded until only the river's murmur kept him company. He sent his wives, his children, and all he owned across the shallow water, watching their figures vanish into the dark. The last torch went out, and he was alone, truly alone for the first time since Bethel. There, between the fear behind him and the unknown ahead, something began to shift. The silence seemed to breathe. The ground felt charged, as if heaven itself leaned close. This was the place where the running stopped, where the man who grasped and bargained would meet the God who had been patient enough to wait. He could not see what was coming, but the soul often senses what the eyes cannot. He lay down, exhausted, but sleep would not come. Every memory haunted him, the birthright, the disguise, the farewell kiss to a mother he would never see again. He turned from one side to the other, heart pounding like the river's current. Then from the shadows a figure moved. Whether man or angel he could not tell. The stranger came without a word, only presence and power. In a heartbeat the stillness broke, the sound of struggle, the scrape of earth, the rush of breath. Jacob wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Every muscle strained, every heartbeat echoed like prayer through pain. It was not just a fight for life, it was a fight for identity, for peace, for God himself. And though Jacob's body weakened, something stronger began to rise within him, a resolve not born of pride, but of surrender. The hours stretched, the river whispered, and heaven waited. Jacob clung to the stranger with trembling arms, unwilling to let go. unwilling to lose the one thing he had always sought but never truly found, a blessing that could not be stolen. The sun had not yet risen, but the first light of transformation was already beginning to burn. The water of the Jabbok glimmers faintly under a fading moon, and in the heart of a weary man, the real battle has just begun. The struggle at the river began without warning, as if the darkness itself had taken form. One moment Jacob stood alone in prayer, the next he was caught in the grip of a stranger. No words, no explanation, only the force of flesh against flesh, a collision between human fear and divine mystery. They wrestled until the sand turned cold beneath their feet and the stars dimmed above them. Neither spoke. The river murmured as though afraid to interrupt. This was no ordinary encounter. This was heaven descending into human weakness, God meeting a man not with thunder or fire, but with hands that refused to release him. For the first time in his life, Jacob could not scheme or run. He could only hold on. The night stretched long. Sweat mixed with dust. Every muscle in Jacob's body burned, yet the stranger did not relent. It was a contest of wills, a test of surrender. Jacob, who had always seized what he desired, birthright, blessing, wealth, was now forced to fight for something he did not understand. Hours passed. Neither prevailed. Then with a touch, not a blow, not a strike, just a touch, the stranger dislocated the socket of Jacob's hip. Pain shot through him, sharp and final. His strength vanished. His body collapsed, but his spirit refused to yield. Gasping, limping, trembling, he still clung to the mysterious figure. "Let me go," the stranger said, "for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob's answer was desperate and defiant. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The demand was not arrogance, it was confession. It was the cry of a man who had finally realized that only God could give what he had chased all his life. The stranger paused. The fight stilled. Then came the question that pierced deeper than any wound. "What is your name?" Jacob answered the only truth he had left. Jacob, the supplanter, the deceiver, the one who grasped and ran. Speaking the name was like admitting his guilt, his entire story compressed into a single word. And then the answer came, spoken with quiet authority that reshaped eternity. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." It was not victory through power, but through perseverance, through surrender. In that instant, Jacob understood. The blessing he sought was not a reward for strength, but the mercy that comes when strength is gone. God did not lose the battle. Jacob lost himself, and in losing, found grace. As the first light broke over the horizon, the stranger touched him once more, not to wound, but to bless. The dawn revealed a changed man. The limp in his step would never fade, a reminder etched into his body that divine encounters leave marks. Jacob named the place Peniel, saying, "I have seen God face to face, and my life has been spared." The air smelled of river and dust, of sweat and salvation. The old Jacob had fought his way through life. The new Israel would walk with a limp but with peace. When the sun finally rose over the valley, he stood between night and day, between past and promise, leaning on his staff, no longer fleeing from the world, but walking toward it. The limp was not a curse. It was proof that he had been touched by God. The sound of hooves and voices grew faintly from beyond the ridge. The dawn, warm and bright, revealed movement on the horizon. 400 figures advancing, sunlight glinting off their weapons. His brother was near, but Jacob did not hide. He adjusted his cloak, felt the weight of the blessing still resting on him, and stepped forward into the light. The man who wrestled in the dark now limps toward the morning, and on the other side of the rising sun, a brother waits. Morning poured over the hills of Gilead like molten gold. The river behind him whispered of struggle and surrender. The road ahead shimmered with the heat of confrontation. Jacob limped forward, each step a sermon written in pain and grace. The limp was not weakness, it was testimony. He had met God in the darkness and survived. But survival was not the end of his journey. There remained one more face to see, the face of the brother he had deceived, the brother who had once vowed to kill him. The sun rose higher, revealing the dust of 400 men moving swiftly across the plain. Esau was near. Jacob arranged his family in careful order. The servants and their children first, then Leah and hers, and finally Rachel with young Joseph at the rear. The shepherd who had once sent flocks ahead as gifts now took the lead himself. He bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother, each bow breaking a little more of the pride that had ruled his life. The air trembled with tension, every heartbeat loud enough to hear. Then before Jacob could bow again, Esau ran toward him. There was no sword in his hand, no anger in his face, only tears. He embraced Jacob, fell upon his neck and kissed him, and they wept. The years of silence, of separation, of sin, dissolved in a single moment of mercy. The man Jacob had feared became the mirror of the God he had just encountered, strong enough to forgive, gentle enough to restore. When Esau lifted his eyes, he saw the women and children standing behind Jacob. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob answered softly, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." One by one, the wives and sons came forward and bowed. Esau's eyes lingered on the herds spread across the valley. "What do you mean by all these gifts?" Jacob replied, "To find favor in your sight, my lord." But Esau shook his head. "I have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have." Jacob insisted, his voice trembling with gratitude. "No, please accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably." Esau relented and accepted. The gift was not about wealth, it was atonement, an offering from a man who finally understood that reconciliation is the richest blessing of all. As the day wore on, Esau offered to accompany Jacob, to travel together as brothers once more. But Jacob, cautious and tender, declined. "My lord knows that the children are weak and that the flocks and herds are nursing. If they are driven too hard for even one day, the animals will die. Please go ahead of your servant. I will travel slowly according to the pace of the flocks and the children." Esau agreed and turned back toward Seir, leaving Jacob with a heart both relieved and heavy. Some distances must remain, not from anger but from wisdom. Forgiveness had been given, but trust, like healing, takes time. Jacob journeyed north to a place called Sukkoth. There he built shelters for his livestock and a house for his family. The name meant booths, a reminder that rest in this world is always temporary. From there he crossed into Canaan and arrived safely at the city of Shechem. He bought a plot of land and pitched his tent there, setting up an altar and calling it El Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel. It was the first time the new name had been spoken aloud by his own lips, the first time he worshipped not as Jacob the deceiver, but as Israel, the man transformed by divine encounter. The altar stood as both confession and declaration. God had been faithful through every twist of the path. The night by the Jabbok had changed him forever, but transformation is not the same as perfection. The scars of old choices still lived in his family and in his heart. Yet as Jacob looked across the land of promise, he knew what mercy meant. It was not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace that followed it. The face of his brother had become a living reflection of the face of God. What he had feared most had turned into what he needed most: a reunion, a release, a redemption. The river had given him a new name. The embrace had given him a new heart. The altar burns low in the twilight, smoke rising toward the quiet heavens. But beyond the peace of Canaan, loss waits to test the name he now bears. The sun sank low over the hills of Canaan, painting the sky in shades of copper and crimson. The long journey was over, or so it seemed. Jacob had returned, reconciled with his brother, settled in the land of promise, and built an altar to the God who had walked with him through exile and fear. Yet life rarely ends in peace without first testing the peace it gives. The man now called Israel would soon learn that faith does not remove suffering, it redeems it. The same God who had touched his hip and renamed his soul was still shaping him through love. Loss and the slow refining of years. Rachel's laughter once filled his tents, bright as the first morning after rain. She was the dream he had served 14 years to earn, the heart that made the waiting sweet. But along the road from Bethel to Ephrath, her cries broke the still air. Labor pains tore through her body as they neared Bethlehem. In the final moment, she brought forth a son and named him Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow. Jacob knelt beside her, tears blurring the dust. He whispered over her fading breath, "You shall be called Benjamin, son of my right hand." The woman he loved most slipped into silence, leaving him with a newborn and a grave marked by a single pillar of stone. That day, Israel limped away from the burial site with a wound no angel had given and no prayer could erase. Yet even in the ache, he carried the same truth he had learned by the river. Blessing is often disguised in brokenness. Time flowed on, as rivers do, and sorrow softened into memory. The sons of Jacob grew, their hearts shaped by jealousy, rivalry, and dreams too large for the tents they shared. Another shadow fell when Joseph, the son of Rachel, the child of promise, was taken from him. His brothers brought a torn robe soaked in blood, and Jacob's grief fell upon him like winter. He tore his garments and wept for days, refusing to be comforted. "I will go down to my son mourning," he said. Yet through loss upon loss, God remained. The promise whispered to Abraham still ran in Jacob's veins, now passed into the 12 sons whose stories would stretch across centuries. From deception to destiny, from grasping to grace, God was weaving redemption from every thread of Jacob's life, even the dark ones. Years later, famine would drive Jacob to a foreign land, and there, in Egypt, the son he thought was dead would embrace him once more. Old and weary, Jacob leaned on his staff, his eyes dim yet shining with understanding. The God who had met him at Bethel, who had wrestled with him at the Jabbok, who had walked beside him through Haran and Canaan, had never once let him go. Even the limp that slowed his steps had become a sacred rhythm, a reminder that divine strength is made perfect in weakness. When the time came for him to bless his sons, Jacob spoke not as a schemer or a fugitive, but as Israel, the man who had seen God's face and lived. His voice trembled, but his words carried eternal weight. The God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who delivered me from all harm, may he bless these sons. At last he rested his head in peace. His life had begun grasping a heel and ended holding the promise. The world might remember him for deceit, for struggle, for the limp that never left him, but heaven remembered him for the faith that refused to let go. The story of Jacob is not about a perfect man, but a persistent one. The man who fought with God did not win by strength, but by surrender. And through his scars the light of mercy still shines. The tent falls silent. The staff rests beside a sleeping hand. And from the dust of a wounded man rises the name that will never die, Israel.